What would you do if your unelected neighbors tried to legislate your grief? If they put a price on your last connection to the person you loved most, stamped it with a due date, and called it a community bylaw? The letter from the Kingwood Service Association arrived on a Tuesday, its crisp envelope, a sterile white, against the dark wood of the porch floor. It spoke of aesthetic harmony and property values. But all Marco read was a demand to bulldoze his wife's final wish. He looked from the paper, thin and official in his calloused hand, to the statue of the Virgin Mary standing in the center of his lawn. She was carved from a single block of Carrara marble, her hands open in a gesture of welcome, her head tilted with a look of serene contemplation. The Italian sun was baked into her stone, a warmth that had outlasted the journey across the ocean, a warmth that felt like the only light left in his world. The letter demanded her removal within 14 days. It was the final notice. Marco Ortiz was a carpenter, a man who understood the grain of wood and the heft of a hammer. He built things that were meant to last: cabinets, bookshelves, the sturdy frame of a home. For 30 years, he had lived on a quiet cul-de-sac in the Elm Grove village of Kingwood, Houston, Texas. He and his wife, Elena, had chosen this place for its towering pines and its promise of quiet living. Now, the silence in his house was a physical weight. It coated the furniture in a thin layer of dust and muted the colors of the photos on the mantelpiece. His yard, however, was a fortress of order. The St. Augustine grass was a perfect uniform green, edged with the precision of a surgeon. The boxwood hedges were trimmed into sharp, geometric lines. This manicured perfection was a lie, a carefully constructed perimeter around the chaos of his sorrow. Inside, the house was a shrine to a life that had ended too soon. Elena's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside her side of the bed. Her favorite mug, painted with little bluebirds, was still in the dish rack, waiting to be put away. Marco moved through these rooms like a ghost, his footsteps too loud in the stillness. The statue had been Elena's project. For years she had saved, clipping photos from magazines of Italian church gardens. "She'll watch over our home, Marco," she'd said, her voice full of a gentle faith he'd always admired but never fully shared. "A mother for our little garden." She'd ordered it from a small studio near Florence, a place she'd found online, and had tracked its shipment across the Atlantic with daily excitement. It was her one grand gesture, her piece of sacred art for their small corner of East Texas. He hadn't understood the expense or the need, but he had understood the light in her eyes when she talked about it. That was enough. Now that light was gone. The HOA letters had started arriving a month after the statue was installed. The first was a polite inquiry, citing Covenant 4.02b, lawn ornaments exceeding 36 inches in height. The second was a formal warning, its language colder, more inflexible. This third one was an ultimatum. They saw a violation, a piece of unapproved decor. Marco saw the last thing Elena had loved, the one promise he had left to keep. He folded the letter, the paper creasing with a sound like dry leaves, and tucked it into his back pocket. He walked out to the statue, the thick Texas air heavy around him, and gently wiped a smudge of dust from her marble cheek. The hospital had smelled of bleach and fear. Marco remembered the relentless, rhythmic beeping of the machines tethered to Elena, a sound that had become the metronome of his life's collapse. He remembered the view from her window at Memorial Herman the Woodlands Medical Center, just a short drive north. He'd stared at the tops of the pine trees, trying to find a single branch that wasn't perfectly still, a sign of life in a world that had frozen in place. Elena's fight with cancer had been brutal and swift, a wildfire that had consumed her in 6 short months. In her final days, she spoke of the statue. "Is she here yet, mi amor?" She'd whisper, her breath thin as a thread. "I want to see her in the garden." He'd lied. A sin he felt lodged in his throat. He'd told her it was delayed, that the shipping company was careful. The truth was, it had already arrived, sitting in a massive wooden crate in their garage. He couldn't bring himself to install it, to complete the picture of a life she would never get to live. It felt like an admission of defeat, A final nail. "Put her where the morning sun will catch her face," she'd instructed, her eyes closed. She should be the first to see the light. He'd held her hand, its warmth fading, and nodded. He promised. 2 days later, he was a widower. The silence that rushed in to fill the space her breathing had occupied was absolute. It was the sound of a universe ending. A week after the funeral at St. Martha Catholic Church in Kingwood, a service attended by 100 people whose faces he couldn't recall, he had unsealed the crate. With the help of his brother and a rented engine hoist, he'd set the Virgin Mary on a concrete pedestal in the middle of the front lawn. It was exactly where Elena had wanted it. The first rays of the morning sun struck the marble, and for a fleeting moment the stone seemed to glow with a soft, internal luminescence. He had stood there, sweat dripping down his temples, and felt nothing but the vast, hollow ache of his failure. He had kept his promise, but he had delivered it to an empty house. The statue wasn't a comfort, it was a monument to his loss. A 5-foot-tall, 800-pound block of pure grief. That was why he fought. The fight wasn't about religious freedom, though he knew some of his neighbors assumed it was. It wasn't about property rights. It was a war against the antiseptic bureaucracy that had defined Elena's final months. The clipboards, the consent forms, the endless paperwork of dying. The HOA's letters, with their numbered clauses and threatening legalese, felt like the same sterile tyranny. To let them take the statue would be to let them erase the last line of the last poem she ever wrote. It would be a second death, and he could not bear that. The deadline came and went. At 10:03 a.m. on a blistering Tuesday in August, a white sedan with the HOA's private security logo pulled up to Marco's curb. A man in a crisp polo shirt and a sun visor stepped out. This was Arthur Henderson, the head of the Architectural Review Committee. Behind him, a tow truck with a small crane arm idled, its diesel engine a low rumble in the humid air. A Harris County constable's vehicle completed the procession, parking a few feet away. Marco was sitting on his front steps, a cup of black coffee untouched beside him. He had been waiting. Henderson approached, carrying a clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Ortiz," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "As per the final notice issued on August 1st, the Kingwood Service Association is here to remedy the covenant violation at your expense." He didn't make eye contact with Marco, addressing his words to the statue itself. Marco stood up slowly, his knees aching. He was not a large man, but his stillness had a density to it. He walked to the base of the statue and placed a hand on her cool marble foot. "You're not touching her," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the lawn, cutting through the engine's rumble. A neighbor across the cul-de-sac, who had been power washing his driveway, shut off the machine. The sudden silence was heavy. From a window next door, a curtain twitched. The constable, a young man with a weary expression, stepped forward. "Sir, this is a civil matter. They have a legal order for the removal of the structure. If you interfere, it becomes a criminal one. Trespassing, obstruction. We can and will arrest you." He said the word arrest with a practiced neutrality, but it landed in the quiet street with the force of a slammed door. Arrest him for protecting a statue of the Virgin Mary, for keeping a promise to his dead wife. Henderson gestured to the two men from the removal company, who began unspooling thick canvas straps. Marco didn't move. He simply stood there, his hand resting on the statue, his back to the men. He looked at the serene face carved from stone, at the gentle, unending patience in her eyes. He thought of Elena, of her hands arranging flowers, of the sound of her laughter in the kitchen. "Go ahead," Marco said, his voice cracking slightly. "You'll have to take me with her." A woman down the street, retrieving her mail, audibly gasped and hurried back inside her house. The two workers hesitated, looking from Marco to Henderson, their straps held uselessly in their hands. The standoff dissolved into a tense negotiation. Henderson, clearly unprepared for a man willing to be arrested over a garden decoration, made a series of agitated calls. The constable spoke into his radio, his voice a low murmur. In the end, they gave Marco an ultimatum. 24 hours. A crew would return at 10 a.m. the next day. If the statue was still there and if he interfered, the arrest would be immediate. The vehicles drove away, leaving deep tire tracks in the soft grass at the curb. The neighborhood's silence was now charged with opinion. Marco felt it as he walked to the corner store for milk later that afternoon. He saw the whispers, the quick glances followed by averted eyes. In the checkout line at the HEB on Kingwood Drive, a woman he recognized from the neighborhood homeowners meeting gave him a look of pure disdain, shaking her head as she pushed her cart past. But an older man, stocking shelves in the produce section, caught his eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The community was a fractured thing, a collection of private judgments behind closed doors. That evening, a car he didn't recognize slowed as it passed his house. A teenage girl in the passenger seat rolled down the window and yelled, "Get a life, old man," before the car sped off. An hour later, as he sat on his porch, another car stopped. A woman got out, walked halfway up his driveway, and set down a small bouquet of grocery store daisies. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, then at the statue, and left. The gesture of hesitant charity felt as unsettling as the teenager's insult. He was no longer just Marco Ortiz, the widower. He was a symbol, a public spectacle, a problem for some and a silent hero for others. He wanted to be neither. He just wanted to be left alone with his memories. He didn't sleep. As night deepened, the battle shifted inward. The quiet strength he had shown that morning crumbled into a fine dust of exhaustion and despair. He sat on the front steps, the concrete still holding the day's oppressive heat, and stared at the statue. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The air was thick with the drone of cicadas and the distant hum of traffic on Westlake Houston Parkway. Each sound was a reminder of a world moving on without him, a world that had rules he no longer had the strength to fight. A tightness bloomed in his chest, a familiar pressure that had been his constant companion since Elena's diagnosis. His hands trembled, a slight, uncontrollable tremor he tried to hide by clenching them into fists. He felt a profound isolation, not just from his neighbors, but from God. He had not prayed in months. His faith, once a quiet and steady thing he'd shared with Elena, had evaporated in the sterile corridors of the hospital. What kind of God allowed such suffering? What kind of heaven demanded such a price for entry? He looked at the marble face of the Virgin, her expression of endless mercy, and felt a surge of something cold and hard. She had watched over everything and done nothing. He thought about the morning, the constable, the tow truck, the shame of being a neighborhood problem. Maybe Henderson was right. Maybe it was just a thing. A block of stone he had loaded with a meaning it couldn't possibly bear. The thought of surrender was tempting. He could let them take it. He could retreat back into the dusty silence of his house and be invisible again. The fight was gone. All that remained was a vast, hollow space where his heart used to be. He rested his head in his hands, the rough skin of his palms scraping against his unshaven cheeks. He was alone, and tomorrow they were coming. The change began with silence. It was just after 2 a.m. One moment, the night was a symphony of insect noise and distant machinery. The next, it was gone. The drone of the cicadas ceased not by fading, but by being switched off. The hum of the highway vanished. Marco lifted his head, a strange sense of alarm cutting through his fatigue. The world had gone utterly still, a profound and absolute quiet he had never experienced. It was the silence of a photograph, of a world holding its breath. Then came the light. It started as a faint, pearlescent shimmer at the base of the statue, a soft pulse of oyster shell luminescence. It wasn't a reflection from a passing car or a street light. This light came from within the marble itself. It grew steadily, not in a blinding flash, but in a slow, gentle swell, climbing the folds of the Virgin's robes until her entire form was suffused with a warm, silvery glow. The light didn't cast shadows. It seemed to absorb them, softening the hard edges of the world and filling the yard with the tender radiance of a full moon on water. Across the street, in a 2-story brick home, Eleanor Gable was awake. Her youngest son had a fever, and she was walking the downstairs hall with him, trying to soothe his fretful cries. She glanced out the living room window, a habit born of suburban vigilance, and stopped dead. A soft, impossible light was emanating from the Ortiz lawn. It wasn't a spotlight. It was a presence, a gentle and contained brilliance that lit up the marble figure at its center. Her son stopped crying, his head turning on her shoulder toward the window, his eyes wide. The scent arrived on a breeze that wasn't there. A fragrance, rich and complex, filled the air. It was the smell of roses. Not the faint, hybrid scent of modern garden roses, but the deep, heady perfume of an old-world bloom, something wild and ancient. Marco knew the smell instantly. Elena had once grown a single stubborn bush of Castilian roses, a gift from her grandmother. The scent was a memory made real, a phantom limb of his past life restored. It wrapped around him, a current of impossible sweetness in the humid Texas night. He felt the cold knot of anger in his chest begin to dissolve. He rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on the luminous figure before him, and took a hesitant step forward. The light held for a full minute, a silent, breathtaking tableau. Then, as gently as it had arrived, it began to recede, drawing back into the stone until only the cool white marble remained, gleaming under the ordinary glare of the streetlights. The sounds of the night rushed back in, the cicadas, the traffic, the low hum of an air conditioner kicking on next door. The world was as it had been, yet everything had changed. Marco stood on the damp grass, the impossible fragrance of roses still clinging to the air, and for the first time since Elena's death, he felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He did not understand what he had seen, but he understood the feeling it left behind, a sense of peace that passed all understanding. The coldness in his soul broke. A sob tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sound he hadn't made even at the funeral. He fell to his knees on the damp St. Augustine grass, the posture of surrender feeling alien to his stubborn body. He wasn't kneeling to the statue, not to the marble or the light. He was kneeling to the memory, to the love, to the vast and terrifying mystery that had just unfolded before him. The tears came then, a hot, cleansing flood that he didn't fight. He wept for Elena. He wept for his own foolish pride, for the anger he had nursed like a precious coal. He had been fighting for a stone monument, when Elena's real monument was the love he had locked away inside himself. He stayed there for a long time, the wet grass soaking through the knees of his jeans, the sounds of the ordinary night returning around him. He didn't pray with words. His prayer was the shuddering of his shoulders, the salt of his tears on his lips. It was a wordless admission of his own smallness in the face of something so immense. He had demanded an answer from a silent heaven, and heaven, in its own time and its own way, had answered not with a voice, but with a presence. He had asked for a sign, and had been given a silent, fragrant, luminous grace. When the first hints of dawn began to pale the eastern sky, he finally pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, but his spirit felt strangely light. As he turned to go back inside, he saw it. At the base of the statue, nestled against the cold marble pedestal, lay a single rose. It was a white rose, its petals flawlessly formed and tipped with the faintest blush of pink, heavy with dew. It was a variety he had never seen before, and it was perfect. It hadn't been there before. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it had not been there. He reached down and gently picked it up, its stem cool and smooth in his trembling hand. He brought the bloom to his face and inhaled. It smelled of peace. Arthur Henderson drove past Marco's house at 7:15 a.m., his usual time. He was expecting to see a moving truck, or perhaps Marco in the frantic process of trying to comply. Instead, he saw Marco Ortiz on his knees, not in defiance but in service. He was carefully, methodically pulling the few stray weeds that had crept into the flower bed at the base of the statue. There was a bucket of water and a soft cloth beside him, and he was wiping down the marble pedestal with a gentle reverence. Henderson slowed his sedan, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. He saw not a violation, but a man tending a shrine. He didn't stop. He just drove on, a little more slowly than usual. An hour later, Eleanor Gable walked across the street, a thermos in one hand and 2 ceramic mugs in the other. Marco looked up from his work as she approached. "I thought you might need some coffee," she said, her voice soft. She didn't mention the light. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not pity, but a shared and unspoken wonder. "It's a beautiful statue," she added, pouring the dark liquid into a mug. "My mother would have loved it." They stood in the growing morning heat, drinking their coffee in a comfortable silence. The ripple continued. A high school kid who lived 3 doors down, the one who usually sped down the cul-de-sac with his music blasting, came jogging past. He saw a discarded fast food bag near the curb in front of Marco's lawn. Without breaking stride, he stooped, snatched it up, and carried it with him to his own trash can. It was a small, almost invisible act of correction. Later that morning, the constable who had delivered the warning drove past on his patrol. He saw Marco trimming the hedges, a small, genuine smile on his face as he waved to Mrs. Gable. The constable felt a wave of profound relief and kept driving, the unresolved call from the day before now feeling settled in a way he couldn't explain. At 10 a.m., the hour of the ultimatum, no trucks arrived. The street remained quiet. The letters from the Kingwood Service Association simply stopped. There was no apology, no official rescission. The violation, it seemed, had vanished from the ledger. The silence from the HOA was a quiet admission of a truth that now seemed self-evident to everyone on the cul-de-sac. The statue of the Virgin Mary was no longer just a lawn ornament. It had become the heart of their small street. Marco's new mission was not to fight, but to tend. He tore out the perfectly manicured, sterile boxwoods and planted a garden around the statue's base. He filled it with flowers Elena had loved, daylilies, verbena, and a single hardy bush of Castilian roses he ordered from a specialty nursery in California. His yard was no longer a fortress. It was an invitation. People began to stop by, not in droves, not like a tourist attraction, but in a slow, quiet pilgrimage. A neighbor who had just lost his job would park his car and just sit on the curb for a few minutes, staring at the garden. A young couple pushing a stroller would pause on their evening walk, the wife reaching out to gently touch a rose petal. Marco would often be on his porch, and he would offer a simple nod. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a form of welcome. His grief had become a shared space, a place of quiet contemplation for a community that hadn't known it needed one. One evening, a young woman in hospital scrubs stopped her car and walked up his driveway. "Mr. Ortiz?" she asked hesitantly. He recognized the logo on her uniform. Memorial Herman. "I'm a nurse in the oncology ward," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I live a few blocks over. After a hard shift, especially after we lose someone, I drive by here on my way home. I just wanted to thank you. Seeing this, it helps. It really helps." She looked at the Virgin's face, now softened by the evening light. Marco simply nodded, his heart full. The statue was no longer a monument to what he had lost. It was a beacon for what remained. Sometimes, a battle isn't won through defiance, but through surrender. Marco Ortiz's fight with his HOA was never about the rules of men, written on paper. It was about the unspoken laws of the heart. The statue of the Virgin Mary was not a challenge to aesthetic harmony, but an anchor for a love that refused to end with a final breath. In standing his ground, Marco didn't win an argument. He created a space for grace to enter, a grace that not only healed his own broken heart, but rippled outward, touching his neighbors in quiet, unexpected ways. He learned that the most profound monuments are not built of stone, but of the quiet, daily acts of tending to the beauty left behind. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.